I would like to call this meeting of the ARPA Committee to order for Wednesday, February 28th. Appreciate everybody coming together for this discussion. So the purpose today is to talk about some of the allocations that we have for the ARPA funds. As a refresher for everybody watching, the town was awarded about $6.2 million in ARPA relief money, which stemmed from the federal government's efforts to assist municipalities and states even in managing their recovery from the COVID pandemic. And so what we did as a committee early on was to meet and try to come up with a set of ideas for deploying those funds in the best way possible. A lot of those ideas are for great projects and real needs in the community, and they range from investments in people to investments in infrastructure. And I think I certainly applaud the work of the committee in helping us come up with that initial allocation. So a couple of things have happened since then. One of the things is that a few of the projects have actually been implemented, and there are funds left unexpended from those projects that we're in a position to reallocate. And I'll let Kate and Jen talk about those in a minute. The second thing that's happened is that there are a number of cases where we had an allocation recommendation to fund largely human services activities. It turns out that spending money in that way, which is to really empower or to provide funding for nonprofits or agencies who could help in the furtherance of those social services goals, is actually quite complicated. There's a lot of rules and requirements that you have to comply with in order to fund those activities, to the point that we felt that it's really not going to be feasible to provide funding to those groups in the way that we thought. And so as part of the Board of Selectmen discussion about the budget for the upcoming fiscal year, what we did was Kate and Jen, but really the Board of Selectmen as well, went through and looked at the list of ARPA allocations and focused on kind of those two things. One is areas where we felt where we had an ARPA allocation that might not work. And then two, where have we got money that doesn't need to be spent for projects that were finished, or money that was sitting in contingency, and can we go ahead and reallocate and spend those funds now? One other comment on that is that it is important that we get the allocations and the expenditures of these monies in place. All of these funds, as a reminder, have to be allocated and encumbered by the end of 2024, and they have to be spent by the end of 2025. So pretty important that we move this project along. We don't want to get in a position where some of the funds get lost because we didn't allocate or spend them against the government's required timeline. So I'm going to hand this to Kate and Jen now just to do a walkthrough on some of the projects that we have identified to be reallocated. Just so everybody knows, that total reallocation, I think, is $470, and I call it $480,000 that we've pulled from these existing projects. You'll see in the spreadsheet that I forwarded that Kate and Jen prepared, both the list of projects where we are proposing taking money out and reallocating it, and then the new projects where we would propose actually committing those funds. We did that as part of the Board of Selectmen vote on the budget a couple of weeks ago, and that's where we get the $480,000. So you'll see that list of projects on the last page of this spreadsheet, and they range from, well, I won't go through the list, I'll let Kate and Jen do that, but our proposal is to take those funds away from the existing ARPA allocation and to fund these initiatives here. The last thing I'd say is that this is not about saying that we can't do any of this funding, right? Or we can't actually provide funding that's suggested in these allocations. What this is a suggestion is, look, we've got money here that's not going to be spent on those projects, or it's going to be too hard to do that. We'd like to spend it on something else right now. If others want to come forward and still propose that we spend those funds in those ways, that's okay. We can have a separate allocation to do that. It's not necessary that we do this with ARPA funding. We should get this ARPA funding spent right away, right now, so that we don't have a risk of losing some of that funding because we missed some of these deadlines. So let me cut off my initial comments there, and I'll turn it over to Kate and Jen.
Okay, does anybody need me to share my screen so you see the list of projects? 'Cause I can do that.
It might be helpful just if we've got a TV audience that's watching the discussion, but up to you. Great.
Okay. All right, so I basically did two things. One, I looked at the projects and for ones that I thought we were going to have difficulty spending in a timely manner to be compliant with the grant. But then I sent the status report of all the projects to all the department heads who had projects with balances and asked them for status update. And that's where we came up with a lot of the monies. And I also, because a lot of what we were looking at reallocating was human resource money, I spoke to Ally. I'm not going to say that Ally was thrilled with everything I proposed, but she was aware of what I was proposing. So the majority of these did come from departments saying my project is done. You can take that much, or in some instances they say, my project is almost done. I know you can have, like, for example, the fire marshal's vehicle. I know you can have $7,000. There may be more left to take later. So that's how we arrived at the numbers to be reallocated. On the other end, we looked at projects that were in the budget that could be done and completed by the end of this fiscal year, by the end of this calendar year, specifically targeting some big purchases, but things that were also necessary and valuable to do, like the police pistols, the rifles, the fire marshal truck conversion, fixing the cracks in the basketball court for Parks and Rec and the fence, and the loader, trying to make sure we get as much of this money spent as possible. So Jen, I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I have nothing to add. I think you covered it.
And so that's where we are. What I'm hoping to do is just get a discussion here, see if you guys have any questions about this, but this is the proposed reallocation that I'd like to kind of get approved. To be clear, the Board of Selectmen has already voted this into the budget, but if the collective view here is that you guys just simply don't want to do that, and if we've got a majority vote that would suggest these reallocations are not the direction you want to go, then we'll consider that.
Questions? Can you hear me okay?
Yep, loud and clear.
It's been said multiple times publicly, and I think, John, this may just be a slip of the tongue, but it's been said multiple times that the money has to be encumbered by the end of this year and spent by the end of 25. The actual date is 26.
Yeah.
It's December 31st, 26.
My mistake.
Yeah, so I just want, and that's, I just want to make sure that the public is aware and the committee is aware of what the accurate dates are.
Yeah.
The second thing I would say is it's been 2 years since this committee, this committee met initially in December of 21, put forth our recommendations in the spring of, in the winter of 22, and I believe in March of 22, our initial project list was approved by the Board of Selectmen, the Board of Finance, and the RTM. So it's been 2 years almost to the date since we've had a list. Now that list has been modified over time, but we've had 2 years to basically spend the money that we thought we could spend on these various projects. I'd like to talk about that in two kind of buckets. The first is we have $320,000 that we allocated to the Fire Commission 2 years ago, not a dollar of which has been spent. So that was identified over 2 years ago as projects that we needed to fund 2 years ago. There's been no progress, to my knowledge, visibly on any of those projects. Not a dollar of ARPA money that was allocated to the Fire Commission has been spent. So that's my first concern. And I guess, is that really a need if it's been 2 years and there's been literally zero progress on any of those projects? The second is, and John, you touched on this, is the whole mental health community service aspect of this. And I think those of us that have been on the committee since the outset understand that there are challenges with identifying the way that money can be spent and tracking it in a manner that ensures that that money won't be reclaimed from the federal government. However, we've had 2 years to figure out this maze. We spent $37,000. We spent $34,000 in mental health, and we spent $16,000 in food insecurity. So, A, why haven't we been able to figure out this maze on the balance? And B, what was it that we were able to figure out that let us spend the 50? If we spent 50, why couldn't we have done more than the 50 in a manner that was consistent with the rules of the road? Because we have spent some money there. So maybe that's a question for Allie. The first question, maybe it's a question for Kate on the fire commission.
Okay, so
Great
first, let me
questions.
just
Go ahead.
address one other thing. It's not just that the money has to be encumbered by the end of this calendar year. We actually have to have a contract signed with the vendor. Okay.
Yep.
So, and that answers part of your question on the mental health later. The fire commission is finally making progress. Jen and I had met with them previously to discuss our concerns with the fact that they were not making much progress in spending this money. But they do have a bid that they've accepted on the upgrade of the catch basins. There's a bid out, or they expect to be bidding the drill tower classroom in March. Paving is going to be coordinated with the public works in the summer. So they want to do things, they don't want to be redoing work. So they want to be able to get the water main and the catch basins in before they pave, so that they don't have to then rip up the paving. So my expectation is if we don't have progress and good progress by the summer, then we have to talk about reclaiming that money. As for the mental health, yes, we have spent some of the money. We spent some of the food insecurity money. The nonprofits was the really trickiest one, because as we learned more and more about the regulations, we became concerned about doing a sub-grant. So we have tried to spend those funds in a way that was beneficial. And we are not taking all those funds, so that Ally does still have some funds to spend. But again, because we have to actually have contracts signed to a vendor by the end of the calendar year, we've talked about going back in September and having a discussion about what can we, what's left, how much more can we actually spend on these types of programs, and then see where we are and what might need to be reallocated. Jen or Ally, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Well, I think it's important, as you said, Dan, from the beginning when we started this in January of 22, it's evolved, right? And Jen, you could speak to that further, but what we originally thought was kind of an arbitrary decision, right? Like thinking we should put money into mental health, into nonprofits, into food insecurity. And then we found out over time that it's much more complicated than we originally expected. In terms of what we've spent so far for the mental health piece, we've most of that has gone to mental health first aid training. We've done, I think it's now a total of 11 trainings since May of 2022. Paula Sutliff and I have been trained in it, and we've offered that free to the community with ARPA funds. In terms of the food insecurity, we've spent that money on gift cards for our clients, our low-income clients, and the holidays, and that's what we plan on doing in the future, because those gift cards also, we can use throughout the year. So we did use them in the holidays and then back to school, but we plan on, being able to use those for our clients throughout the year, and even, keep them, past 24, we can still use them and keep a very detailed spreadsheet of how we're using those. Did you have more?
Do you have a response to the email we received from Ms. Daniels with respect to some specific ideas for dollars that it looks like it's maybe one-time items that could be spent this year? Have you had a chance to review that? It appears that she consulted with you before sending that email. And do you have an opinion as to whether any, or just an opinion on those specific ideas?
Yeah, Amy and I met yesterday. before she sent the email, and we went over some of her ideas. We have used some of, actually, that maybe backtrack. Some of the mental health money also did go to a program. And Amy, well, I guess I don't know if you can have public comment, but for a program at the depot, which I believe it was about 40 children. It's his name is Chuck Hatchett, and he's included in doing another program in the future. So that was one, I think it was $6,000 that we spent for him, and we're talking about expanding that. It was for middle school students, for boys, I believe, and there's talk about doing that in the future for the high school students as well. So some of those proposals that Amy did propose, yes, we discussed those, and then there were some one-off. There was a sports psychologist talking about bringing him to town in conjunction, as Amy's email said, with other entities within town, like the Thriving Youth, the schools, community fund. So there are some of those proposals, absolutely, that we figured we could do and that we could directly pay the vendor. That was part of the problem, was that, and interrupt me if you want to, Kate or Jen, but that was part of the problem, is obviously, like John said too, tracking that money and making sure that it's, very carefully monitored.
Yeah, the one thing I would add is you read through her email, which again, we appreciate receiving, but a lot of these actually do feel like they are starting an expenditure in something that's going to be an enduring commitment, right? So you look at, these are programs at the high school and the middle school, these are speaker programs, all of that. And again, it's not to say that that would be something we shouldn't do, but my own view is that it's not necessary to say these are ARPA expenditures, right? What I'd rather do is say, look, mental health is an important thing for the community. It's something that the town does and the Board of Education does. It's something that cuts across town residents, our students, our faculty, our town employees. And what I think we ought to do is say, take this notion of ARPA and set that aside for a moment and say, let's take a full and complete stock of where we are on mental health investments being made by both the town and the school system, and take stock of that and say, here's everything we have, all the assets, all the enduring expenditures. Here's what some other communities are doing. Where are some deficiencies that we should do. And coming out of all that, here are some recommendations that the town could pursue, or the Board of Education could pursue, or we could all pursue, that really would make the most difference for us from a mental health standpoint. I think trying to rush in and go spend money on some of these initiatives, some of which could result in disappointment if we don't fund them in future years or decide to go a different direction. It feels rushed and uncoordinated. And so it's not that I'm not supportive of these mental health initiatives. I just think trying to rush and get all this done because of ARPA deadlines is not the right way to go. We should decouple these. Let's focus on mental health more broadly, and then let's get this ARPA money spent on things we know we can get spent in time for the deadline, so we don't miss out on any of these funds.
Hey, John, it's Jim here. Just one question on some of this stuff, and I kind of completely agree with your approach here, but I think a lot of the dollars that we were originally targeting would go out in the way of grants. And I think isn't there a sort of intense tracking of those grantees in terms of how they take the money and how they use the money and their need to actually report back to us?
Well, I think that's what Kate's talking about in terms of some of this reporting complexity.
Right. They would have to follow all the rules that we have to follow, and we would be responsible for them. So if they failed to follow the rules and we had to give the money back.
So Kate,
that's the
Kate,
concern.
to drill down on that, if we gave them the grant expecting they were going to do A and B, and instead they did B and C, a portion of the dollars that we actually gave them, if it wasn't outlined directly, we could be on the hook to actually have to refund that.
Yeah.
That's my understanding. Jen, do you want to add anything?
I would say it even goes beyond what they spend the money on, but how they go about selecting their vendors. They have to follow the same purchasing requirements, competitive bidding requirements, checking for debarment, all of the things that we have to do when we select a vendor. And if those aren't followed, we would be subject to possibly having to return the funds.
Yeah, so again, my point earlier, I think, is an important one, which is it's not we're saying no to any of this, right? I think what we're saying is we want to decouple these mental health initiatives from ARPA funding. and direct the ARPA funding to stuff we can get spent now, get it off our plates and have all that confirmed. We don't make a misstep and lose some of that money. And then to turn our sights more broadly, if we decide as a town that's the way to go, to all of these mental health initiatives and say, as a town, where should we really be making investments, how that should be coordinated with the Board of Education, and then take a step back and say, let's rethink our allocations out of the whole town budget and forget about ARPA funding and the limitations that we have with that impacting this.
So, John, I guess what I would say is maybe we could do a little bit of both, because I totally agree with the notion that we should think about this from a long-term perspective and come up with a strategy. But literally that's kicking it down the road and from today, necessarily kicking it down the road from today. And we're in a world where we have both the town and the school board have put forth 6-7% budget increases. There's not a lot of money in either the town or the Board of Education's budgets to fund additional spending on what might be an expanded initiative or a new initiative. And here we have a pocket of money that could make a difference to the kids that are in class today. And we could affect this class that's graduating in 24, and to some degree, the class that's graduating in 25, and all the students that are younger than them, by giving them something. And it's not going to be, it doesn't add up to tens of thousands. It doesn't add up to $100,000. It adds up to tens of thousands of dollars. And you're right. It might lead to an expectation that it's funded in the future, but we would at least have used some of this money to a greater degree for this incredibly important, if not the most important issue that this town is facing.
I hear you. I think, again, if we're going to do this, if there's an urgent need to spend money on some of these things, I'm all in favor of that. I think that's completely fine. And you're quite right to bring up the point that mental health remains an enduring crisis, not just in this town, but in many other towns, and that we should do all we can as a town and as a community to make investments to try to stem the tide, if you will, on that crisis. That said, I am nowhere near qualified to come in and say exactly what those expenditures should be. And with all due respect, I don't think anybody on this call is. What we really need is the professional mental health community to come forward and join the discussion and say, look, here's where we are in terms of our expenditures now and our efforts now. And here are some things where, as professionals, and given our experience with this, where we think you would have the most impact in trying to make expenditures. I don't think there's, as a group here, we're in the best position to say this investment versus that one makes the most difference. And I respect Amy's list of suggestions that she's provided to us, but I'm not qualified to say that that's going to be the best use of taxpayer money at this time, or ARPA money for that matter. And I'm not differentiating between the two. We should be equally responsible with both sources of funds. I'm not prepared to say at this point that I know any better than anybody else as to whether that's the right thing to spend money on at this moment. If we find something and it's urgent, we can spend it today. But I'm not prepared to say what that is.
If John, on that point, has Dr. Dad, like Alicia Dad, like the mental health director that the schools have hired, sort of full-time employee, her part of her job description, I know, in terms of when they brought her on, was to both sort of oversee and drive mental health initiatives within the school, but also sort of more broadly in the community. Has she reached out for any, like, for the need of any funds or so forth?
Do you want me to speak? Oh, I mean, we work closely with Alicia Dad. She hasn't reached out and specifically asked for funds, but she is part of the mental health task force, and we've been working with her ever since she started. I mean, at least my department, since she started in her position. She or the Board of Ed has not specifically asked for funds, but I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I was just curious. I mean, some of these ideas that were put forward, I think they're, as Dan mentioned, I think they certainly seem worthwhile, but I'd love to, as John's point, see them be kind of coordinated with our broader kind of professionals and brought forward, and whether they're paid for with blue dollars or green dollars.
Yeah,
Uh,
I would add that the good list that was sent over by Amy, a lot of that is really focused on youth and students and all that. And as to the extent those are good ideas, we really should be coordinating that with Dr. Dad. And frankly, the Board of Education should be the ones coordinating that. I mean, these are all geared towards helping those students. And I think trying to do that through the Board of Ed and through the schools is going to make at least some sense, if not most sense, rather than trying to do that as a separate town initiative.
If I was to add some of the things that I know are going on in the Board of Ed budget, I know they have Teen Talk for the high school. And I don't know that there's a desire to take ARPA funds to reduce the Board of Ed budget by paying for that. I also know they're talking about Teen Talk for the middle school now, and I believe they were speaking to one of the outside foundations communities to see if they would fund it for the next year budget. So I'm just putting that out there. But I did want to turn slightly different to what we have here. Well, I have no problem with the list that was presented on the reallocation. One of my concerns is that I think we need to track if an RFP has been issued on this. And so and I hate to give Jen more work, but in that big schedule that we have, like the storage containers for Park and Rec, we don't have an RFP on it yet it was initially discussed in October. I think either the Board of Selectmen and Board of Finance approved it in the November-December timeframe. And what I've seen by just looking at what goes on is, some of these have contingencies associated with it. So as soon as we get an RFP out, we know whether or not there's going to be extra funds that are there. And so, my own personal approach would be, how do I spend $1.9 million in 2024, essentially, so that there's very little going into 2025. And it would include looking at things such as, for fiscal year 26, I believe we have a dump truck on the capital list, and I forget how much it was cost, but let's say it's $250,000. Does it make sense to move that up to 2,000 now? Because we can definitely get the RFP. We'll know exactly what the funds are going to be spending, and we're still saving the taxpayer money. Doesn't matter if it's this year or in 2026, but we're sure of what's going on. As I explained to the RTM on Monday, if we put something down, let's say I'm just going to pick on the basketball court for 22,000, and we have the contract for it as of the end of December, and it comes in at $21,910. Well, that's $90 going back to the federal government. So as soon as we can get an RFP, take out the contingency, because we have other sources to cover contingencies, and get these RFPs out, I think that has to be our focus. I mean, I was jokingly saying, once we have this list, and that includes the fire departments, can we have an RFP dinner that will serve dinner, but you can't leave until your RFP is done, just so that we can get these done and move them forward. I'm saying that a little tongue in cheek, but that's the focus.
Yeah, I think you raise a good point, Jack, and I think I'd offer kind of two comments. I do think we're getting too tied up in this notion of ARPA funding versus all other funding, right? That these are all funds that we can draw on to spend money, right? Mm-hmm. And the ARPA funds have got some hair on them in the sense of reporting and deadlines and kind of all of that. And so if we're going to spend this money, this reallocation is really about saying, tell you what, we're going to put this in some things we can spend right now, right? And to be honest, what I'd really like to do is spend all of this money right now. Mm-hmm. And all the other stuff that gets booted out because we decide to spend money on, we will cover in a later appropriation where we're not bound by the deadlines and restrictions of ARPA funding. So this is about just saying, spend all the ARPA money right now. We will deal with these other ideas later, but let's get it spent and out the door right now so that we don't lose it and we can stop thinking about it, right? The other thing I would say is I hear you about a fiscal 26 truck. I mean, part of the effort of going through this and identifying funds that we could use for the Board of Selectmen budget is to say, look, we're under a lot of budget pressure right now. Part of the benefit of putting all this against fiscal 25 expenditures is it makes the Board of Finance's job a little easier. It's going to take the pressure off the fiscal 25 budget. I think that's a good idea. I further think it's a good idea because fiscal 26 and 27 are years when debt service for HHR, Oxbridge, Great Island, all that starts to come into the fore. If you defer any of this stuff and say, well, we're going to pull things out of those years and take it out of this year, I just think it's better to spend it now in this coming fiscal year, and we'll deal with those years later.
Well, that's why I said move 26 up, because you have HHR and Great Island coming in. We still have Oxbridge and other debt that's out there. I mean, I even floated the idea that on the Hanson Road Bridge, I think it comes in at about 2.3 million. And while we authorized the bonding on the full amount, and we know that we're going to be getting 50% back from the state, we still have some built-in contingency. But that project's supposedly done sometime September, October. We'll at least know what half of it is. And if we were just to allocate $1 million out of that project, bond whatever extra we have because it's already authorized, and reallocate what we have to reallocate, that's $1 million spent over here that we don't need to worry about. So that's the mindset that I have on how do we spend as much as possible or have a firm RFP this year so we don't have these little trickle effects. Because I don't want to give back a penny, personally.
We're not going to. Not going to happen.
Yeah.
Other comments? Okay, so what we have before us is, as I said, the Board of Selectmen has already voted to take this $479,886 out of these active projects for the reasons that we've been discussing. And they have put that against the Board of Selectmen budget. So in other words, we cut what we're proposing for our budget by this amount, and we use the ARPA funds to cover all that. And that's the budget that the Board of Selectmen has submitted to the Board of Finance. So all this is already baked into that process. So the question is, do we need to change that? So you could change it in a couple of ways. You could say collectively, no, we actually don't want to spend that money on that. We really do want to redirect money back to the original allocation and figure out some way to do that. That's a way you could do it. Or you could say, well, that project list is maybe okay, but we don't want to spend it on those projects. We actually want to increase the Board of Selectmen budget and instead, as Jack suggests, spend some of that on fiscal 26 or 27 projects. So that's a flavor of the alternate decisions that you could make. But again, that's what's been voted on by the Board of Selectmen is where we sit now. That's my recommendation is we stick with that. We can certainly fund mental health issues separate from ARPA funds that taking them out of ARPA in no way restricts the town or the Board of Education to pursue mental health related initiatives. We should do that, but we should do it thoughtfully and in conjunction with that board.
So John, if you're looking for a motion to approve the Board of Selectmen closeouts and the Board of Selectmen reallocation, I'll make that motion.
Okay, can I get a second? Jim will second that. All in favor?
Wait, discussion?
Discussion, please, Dan.
So before we vote, Ally, so is there a number above the $16,000 that you would be, I think that's the right number, the $16,000 that you would have left in your mental health bucket? Is there a number above that you have confidence that you could spend effectively in 2024? So what I'm exploring is whether to recommend cutting the amount we're taking out of mental health from 200,000 to some lower number. I don't know what that lower number is. That's why I asked the question of Al.
Okay, I don't have a number off the top of my head, but certainly, I mean, Amy brought some good points up, but as John was saying, we don't necessarily have to use the ARPA funding for that, right? And I think that was part of the problem, is that we're under this pressure to spend the money. I don't have a number off the top of my head. I do agree with some of the things that Amy proposed, and certainly the funding the Chuck Hatchet, and we don't have to go into, I guess, those details right now, and some of the other initiatives off the bat, and then the other ones we'd have to flesh out more and talk more about it, with whoever's, interested in terms of the finance part of it too. So I don't have a number off the top of my head.
Yeah,
So-
I'm sorry to interrupt, but further to that, if we want to march through that list, and maybe there's a broader list of other things that are mental health related we could consider, let's have a discussion about that and just have a separate appropriation, right? We've got fund balance, we've got contingencies. There's lots of ways to fund this. We don't have to fund this with ARPA money, right? Let's clear out this ARPA money now. And if those initiatives that you're talking about make sense, let's have a separate appropriation. We can appropriate funds to move on those things immediately if they have merit. Right?
So, John, I understand that point. I just have some concerns about whether we'll actually allocate those dollars in difficult budget situations that we've got, or in the fiscal year when we've just passed through, when we've just passed the respective budgets. So I'm concerned if we let this money go, we've let it go. Okay, maybe somewhere down the road we'll get it back, but I don't see that happening in the very short term. And sorry, maybe I'm seeing the glass half empty here.
No,
So
these are all fair questions. I hear what you're saying.
I would propose to lower. So I guess I would make a proposal to lower the reallocation of the mental health support number from 200,000 to it's like 150 or 175, to give Allie another $25,000 to $50,000 in addition to the $16,000 that she's been left. And if in 3 months Allie comes back to you and Kate and says, I can't spend this money, then we can give it back then. But if we give it back now, I'm concerned that we will have foregone an opportunity.
Well,
Which of the appropriations would you cut?
I don't have an opinion on that.
You have to have a corresponding
No,
cut on.
I don't actually. The balance would simply have to be part of the budget. That's for you guys to decide.
It's already Board of Finance is going to have to handle that then.
No, I do have one to help. If we need to, if we go to phase 2 I&I study, the original allocation was 580,000. Not all of that was used. So if you want to take 25,000 out of that,
Out of
for the
what?
next,
I'm sorry, what are you talking about?
if you go to I&I study, it's on page 17. It was on page 17. The original allocation was 580,000. It wasn't all used because we received a state grant and we also bonded for part of that. So I believe there's someplace in the neighborhood of about 238,000 that could be applied to the next bonding that we just did.
I don't believe so.
Okay.
$580,000 has all been encumbered.
Yeah, we have multiple funding sources and multiple phases on the I&I study. So there was the first phase was approved for bonding, and we did receive some state grants, but Ed had to go back for additional appropriation for the next phase. And he's planning to spend all of that through bonding, and he's planning to spend the 580 that we got appropriated in ARPA.
Yeah, guys, I think I'd make just sort of a clarification. We're not in a rush to spend money. We're in a rush to make sure we use up the ARPA dollars, because not doing so has significant costs to us in terms of not ensuring they're done. So these projects, which all ranged from like $1,000 to $5,000, if kind of developed by our right sort of department heads and kind of brought forward in the normal appropriation process, I could not see them being appropriated with other funds, whether they be Board of Finance contingency, part of a new budget, or any of the other kind of buckets and so forth we have in our normal operating budgets. And I think, Dan's point that these are all important things. And I think we should be focusing on these things, but we shouldn't all sit here and think that these are only going to be funded by ARPA dollars. I would certainly vote if a good project was put forward in any of these sizes here to support them with any of the other dollars we have in our arsenal.
Yeah, you still have 150,000 in contingency right now.
Yeah.
Thereabouts.
Look, so we have a motion on the table to put through the Board of Selectmen changes in our budget sort of as is, or that the committee would recommend this. But let me just further say, I got a lot of faith in Ally, and if she felt that there was something we needed to do as a town for mental health, which she has a long track record of doing, whether it's mental health training or some other things. I've spent enough time listening to her that I'm completely convinced of her professionalism in that regard. I think if something came up where there was an investment that we could make that would make a difference on mental health, the very last person I would expect in town not to speak up would be Ally Ramstack. She is going to come in and tell us what she thinks and let us know, even if it's not part of a budget process and we need to take urgent action on something. And so I think sort of putting out a carrot, if you will, that says, please come up with a way to spend $25,000 or $50,000 that maybe, it's not readily apparent as in terms of what you would do right now. As she admitted just a few seconds ago, she doesn't have a dollar figure in mind that she would want to spend. And I don't mean to put words in your mouth, Ally, but I really think the better approach here is vote this through in terms of what the Board of Selectmen has done. And then to seriously, collectively, there's lots of elected officials on this call, let's make sure that we continue to press everybody involved in mental health, not just Ally, but the Board of Education and the professionals there, to say, have we done enough to take full stock of where we are on these expenditures, both over the long term and anything we need to urgently do today. And if there is something that the professionals and the collective group agrees that we need to move forward on, we bring it forward and we get it funded. Lots of contingency, lots of fund balance that we could use to cover investments like that. We do not need to do this through ARPA. We just need, as Jim says quite rightly, we need to get ARPA money spent and get this off the table. This is my strong recommendation. Any other discussion? Okay, so we've got Jack has moved and Jim has seconded a motion to keep the reallocations and the board the recommended and these reallocations as the part of the Board of Selectmen budget that was submitted to the Board of Finance, is that we would keep all that the same as we've done that. All in favor? Okay, Jack, Jim, I will vote for that. Me, Kevin, that's 4. Anyone else? Okay, against? Okay, Dan is going to vote against that. Okay. All right, I think that's that. So that passes 4-1. I think that's all we have for this discussion. I appreciate the robust conversation about this. I know this is very important. I do not minimize the need to address mental health at all. I just think we can do it as part of a separate and thoughtful process and not bind this to trying to get ARPA dollars spent. Particularly because I think anything we come up with is going to be an expense that endures over multiple years when ARPA funding does not. So we will report this to the Board of Finance, which Jim obviously knows now. And if as part of those discussions, you guys elect to make further changes in the budget, the Board of Finance obviously can do that. But I think for now, the Board of Selectmen budget and these reallocations will remain as is. Anything else for the good of the order, Kate?
Just if I might, can we add to the ARPA list when the RFP has been written, just as a tracking mechanism? Because I know Jen provides that to the Board of Finance on their monthly budgets. I know we look at it at F&B also. So that helps us all track to see if the RFP has been issued. As I said, the storage trailers for the Park and Rec, and the other ones that we're just transferring there. So we know exactly when that an RFP is there and it's moving forward.
Might I suggest putting the RFP due date would be the better information?
That's even better.
Yeah, one of the things before we close that I'd like to propose is disbanding the ARPA committee. This has been a good discussion, but see, as part of this group, we've got Jim and Dan, you're both on the Board of Finance. Jack sits on the RTM, and everyone else in terms of our town professionals we are in regular discussion about this in any case. All of the funds now have been, I think, reallocated. If something comes up where we are running up against a deadline, I think these respective boards can take these up as part of their discussions. We can start with the Board of Selectmen, it can go to Board of Finance, and then to RTM. Everyone here is going to have to be part of the discussion to make any further changes in this. And so I think it sort of obviates the need to have a separate committee. As Dan, as you pointed out, we haven't met in 2 years to go through all this and probably should have closed out the committee at that time. So my recommendation, if anyone would be willing to move that, is that we vote to disband the ARPA committee and then instead relegate the responsibility for any future reallocations of this to the respective Board of Finance, Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance, and RTM.
John, just as a point of order.
Sure.
Not that you have to worry about me speaking up on any of this.
I was worried, but thankfully you're going to disabuse me of that.
But this doesn't come back to the RTM. In my perspective.
No, you're right. This is all appropriate. That's true.
Right. You guys and the Board of Selectmen make the decision. And for the most part, other than this is also budget related, for the most part, the Board of Finance is necessary to just approve this appropriation. But once the Board of Selectmen has made a decision, from my perspective, it's a done deal.
Okay.
So,
yeah. And John, I think I think the actual disbanding, I think the Board of Selectmen would actually, I think the 5 of you all would probably have to vote to officially disband it. But
that's true, but I wanted to just tee that up with this board here. So if anyone had any strong objections, I wanted to note that, but we will take that up at a future Board of Selectmen meeting. Okay.
yeah, no objections here.
All right.
no objections.
All right. Kate or Jen, anything else? Okay. I very much appreciate everybody joining in today. This has been a great and helpful discussion. And thank you and have a good rest of the day. Could I get a motion to adjourn? Okay. Dan moves, Jim seconds. All in favor? Okay. We stand adjourned. Thanks, friends.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks.